We host events on the biggest challenges and opportunities facing our country. These events are spaces for real conversation, bold ideas, and principled solutions. No matter if you're a seasoned policy expert, a passionate advocate, or simply just curious about the issues that shape our society, you're welcome here. So pull up a seat, ask questions, engage with us, and be part of something bigger than politics, the fight for the soul of our nation. Thanks again for joining us, and please enjoy the program.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. Please welcome Roger Severino, the Heritage Foundation's Vice President of Domestic Policy.
Good morning. I want you to think about what you had for breakfast this morning. Might be a scary question, but for this crowd, probably not that bad. For me, growing up, it was typically something heavily sugary and cornflake based. So if you think about what the American diet is now and was, the cornflake saga is an interesting inflection point. So the Kellogg company wanted to make money, and they thought, we're going to feed the world with flakes, a newly discovered way of processing these grains. And as part of their marketing campaign, they said that a complete breakfast is a glass of orange juice, milk and flakes, or just milk and flakes. That's all you needed. Of course, that's heavily carbohydrate-based, and the preceding breakfast was eggs and meat for the American standard breakfast. So we had these corporate influences that changed the way we ate. And then it was targeted towards children very, very quickly. So there was Frosted Flakes and Fruit Loops, colorful, heavily based in sugar. And whatever nutritional value the carbohydrates had plummeted as it was overwhelmed with sugar being the primary driver. When I go to Home Depot, I go with some frequency, so I know the layouts. In the center is the paint section, and usually the left side is gardening. When I go to Best Buy, I know that the appliances are usually off at the edges and TVs at the other side. One thing that these two stores have in common is at the checkout aisle. You're not going to find electronics and hammers. You're going to find candy and soda at Best Buy and at Home Depot, because they know that whatever you're doing, whatever you're there for, that little sugar temptation is right there waiting for you. So you got your credit card out, your money ready to buy your stuff, and say, wait, I could use a Snickers right now. And of course, it's at eye level for any kids that you may have in tow. So you have all these corporate forces that have been conspiring against American health through nutrition. The obesity rates have skyrocketed, diabetes through the roof. We have all sorts of neurological conditions that we didn't have, allergies that we didn't have, and people are fed up. And now we have this moment with President Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that it's created a new coalition, the MAGA Maha Coalition. Heritage Foundation, we're very proud to be at the forefront of that fight against Big Pharma, against the corrupting health agencies that failed us during COVID, and also against those forces dealing with food that are working against, especially parents trying to raise their kids right. We have panels of experts that we brought together today to discuss the policy solutions that could come out of the sordid history that will be uncovered. We first have to diagnose the extent of the problem and then come up with the ways to deal with a very tricky issue, right? We reached a tremendous success where starvation is not an issue in the Western world. We should celebrate that. But now we have the luxury of saying, you know what? By saving lives on the front end, we are killing lives at the back end with obesity and decreased life expectancy and a lower standard of health. This is not how it has to be. So our goal today, in our discussions with our panelists and you, is to show how we could find a better way to restore Americans' health through diet. To kick us off is our own Jay Richards, our director of the DeVos Center for Human Flourishing. Jay.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, whether in person or online. I have, about a year ago, Heritage started planning for this initiative that we call the Restoring American Wellness. We just didn't want to use MAHA because it seemed like we're sort of stealing a pre-existing brand. But we think that this cluster of issues about health, and especially chronic childhood disease, is the largest gap in the policy arena in Washington, D.C. I mean, the reality is if you wanted to talk about USDA food guidelines, if you wanted to talk about the way in which drugs are added to the CDC vaccination schedule, or there's 25 issues like this that if you follow them, you know how important they are, and you know that they're almost certainly connected to policy, which is usually well-meaning, but the outcomes are often not so much. But there was really no coalition to talk about these things. That happened just about a year ago, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who had championed many of these things, and many of the people that were focusing maybe on one or a few of these issues, came along. They're part of the larger MAHA movement. And then, of course, there's a sort of pre-existing political constituencies in Washington, D.C. None of the officially smart pundits knew that there were massive numbers of Americans. Some might be, sort of socially liberal, politically far left of Bernie Sanders, living in Oregon. Some might be Catholic homeschool moms, right, with 10 kids on a farm in Virginia. Most people in the abstract would think, okay, those people don't have anything in common. They do, because they're all humans. They're all a part of the atmosphere, and they're concerned about the same things if they have children, if they're concerned about their own health. And so we think this is one of the most important things to have happened in American culture and certainly American politics and public policy in the 21st century. A lot of work to be done, and so what we're trying to do is just introduce the key topics one at a time. This happens to be one that I had a lot of pre-existing interest in for various reasons, and so excited to have this event. And what we really want to do is just showcase the experts who have joined us, and so you'll get a kind of once-over lightly introduction to their work. But what we're hoping will happen is that those of you that are interested in this, either for personal reasons or for policy reasons or for whatever reason, that you will dig more deeply into their work. Each of them has at least one really good book that's worth reading. And they're also very good books because they translate a lot of really solid science for general audiences. So without further ado, I will introduce my panel. So the first panel, we're gonna focus mainly on the kind of background of diet and science, not so much on the metabolic diseases. But in case we bury the lead, here's the connection we hope to make persuasively. There's been a massive epidemic of chronic childhood disease. Now, epidemic, it doesn't mean, of course, that it's spread like a respiratory virus, but an epidemic in the sense that you have a massive increase, even accounting for artifacts of diagnosis, a massive increase in certain diseases among children especially, but also adults. And so in the strictly metabolic zone, the intuitive ones would be obesity, type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, it could include in that, and then non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, which wasn't really a thing, and certainly not a thing for children. And now a significant percentage of kids are either diagnosed or maybe underdiagnosed with this condition. So something's happened. Something's happened to us metabolically. Our genes have not fundamentally changed in the last 50 or 60 years, but there's been a massive increase of these, we'll call these chronic metabolic diseases. Now it happens that metabolism plays a role in a lot of other conditions that you wouldn't think of as strictly metabolic, but we're gonna save that topic for a future event. But here's the connection that at the very least, there is a correlation between the two things. There is a correlation in the United States between this massive increase of chronic metabolic diseases among adolescents and adults and the USDA food guidelines, in which the federal government decided to give us all lots and lots and lots of advice about how we should eat. Now, by itself, right, correlation doesn't prove causation, but a lot of people, including me, think that these things are actually connected. Not because there was a conspiracy to make Americans sick, but because a particular scientific picture got calcified, unfortunately, became the sort of official science, and now it's really, really hard to change those. So that's the general backdrop, and with that, we'll get started. So let me introduce the first panel, and then I'll ask them to come up. So the first is Sally Fallon Morell, a friend who's actually a local here in the Washington, D.C. metro area. She's the founding president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, which investigates what constitutes a healthy diet, and she's alerted the public to the danger of modern soy products. Morell's a notable author on the awareness of traditional nutrient-dense diets, as discussed in her best-selling cookbook, Nourishing Traditions, the cookbook that challenges politically correct nutrition and the diet dictocrats. And by the way, we have a copy of this book up here. She received her master's degree at UCLA in English and has contributed to many holistic health publications. She's become a respected voice that effectively communicates the complexity of the health and nutrition field. Morell and her husband own their own farm, putting into practice pasture-based farming, free from corn, soy, GMOs, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. That's a lot of stuff. Gary Taubes, who, by the way, I should mention Gary Taubes and our other panelist, Nina Teicholz, both are very important to me personally because they basically changed my mind on the issues that we're talking about. Gary's an award-winning investigative science and health journalist. He's an author, a nutrition expert. His work challenges the mainstream dietary paradigms, particularly the low-fat, high-carbohydrate recommendations, which he argues have fueled obesity and the diabetes epidemics. Taubes graduated from Harvard with an SB in applied physics, earned his MS in engineering from Stanford, and received an MS in journalism from Columbia University. He co-founded the Nutrition Science Initiative in 2012 to fund rigorous nutrition research. His books include Rethinking Diabetes, The Case Against Sugar, The Case for Keto, a recent book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. Finally, Nina Teicholz. Nina Teicholz, PhD, is an investigative science journalist, an author, and a nutrition policy expert whose work, again, critiques the sort of official dietary guidelines. Teicholz holds a PhD in nutritional science from the University of Reading. She's the founder of the Nutrition Coalition, an independent nonprofit group that promotes evidence-based nutrition policy. She's authored the New York Times bestselling book, The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. She argues that saturated fats in animal foods have been unfairly criticized due to weak evidence. As a researcher, she advocates low-carbohydrate diets as a scientifically valid approach to reverse nutrition-related diseases, promoting animal-based foods while questioning ultra-processed plant oils. Please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. Well, welcome. And Sally, Nina, did you text each other to be coordinated here? And we've got Nina in the middle. Well, it's so good to have you all here. Yes, red for red meat. Oh, of course. Now I'm saying, yeah, I miss the symbolism. Well, so welcome. Sally, I'd like to start with you because a lot of people, of course, many of us in the room are probably familiar with the Weston Price Foundation, who Weston Price was and his work. But talk a little bit about the organization, Weston Price, and this general topic of traditional diets.
Thank you, Jay. Weston Price was a dentist, and during the 30s and 40s, he traveled throughout the world to study isolated traditional people, to see about their health, and to see if he could find any correlation between diet and good health. He found 14 groups that had excellent dental health, no cavities, wide, broad faces, straight teeth, and good overall health. Now, these diets vary. Some were a kind of Gary diet up in the Arctic with only meat and fat. And then in the tropics, there were more carbohydrates in the diet. But there was one basic underlying characteristic of all these diets, and that was nutrient density. So the diets were very high in minerals compared to the diet of his day, but particularly high in the fat-soluble vitamins. These are the vitamins found uniquely in animal fats, organ meats, and certain types of seafood. So the basis of a healthy diet is butter, whole milk, organ meats, liver. We need to eat liver at least once a week. Shellfish like oysters, fish eggs. It's kind of a caviar and pate diet, which is good news for all of us. So it's not just any animal food. It's the very nutrient-dense animal foods that need to be in the diet. These foods were prized for fertility. There was a practice of 6 months of these sacred foods before conception, and then the pregnant women and growing children had these sacred foods. So I would say that butter is kind of the basis of our diet. We advocate for raw whole milk, because it's much more nutrient dense than pasteurized milk, and pastured animal products because they're more nutrient dense than conventional, and learn somehow to eat liver once a week.
Okay, we have the hard word right here at the beginning, so I got to get that out of the way. So I want to come back to you, Nina, and talk about Nina, and then come back to you, Sally. But Nina, I mean, let's just talk. This is so different from what people are sort of used to. This idea that humans somehow for thousands of years were eating animal fats, and yet here we are, which seems to be quite a mystery if it's absolutely deadly. So how did we end up sort of initially in, I don't know what to call this, but this moment of fat phobia, this particular moment in American history?
Yeah, thank you, Jay, for organizing this panel and bringing us all together. Yeah, I think it's really important to realize we have such an embedded belief that fat, and especially saturated fat, are bad for health. We don't even remember that this idea was born in a moment in time. We did not always believe this. So, and that moment really goes back to the 1950s, when heart disease was on the rise from virtually rates zero in the early 1900s to become the #1 killer in America. And Americans were in a panic about what caused heart disease. President Eisenhower has a heart attack in 1955 and is out of the Oval Office. And there's a vacuum of explanations. So, and there were a number of explanations. One was the vitamin deficiency. The other was the rising tide of auto exhaust in the air. And into that vacuum steps a single scientist named Ancel Keys from the University of Minnesota. And it was his idea that saturated fats and dietary cholesterol found in animal foods were causing the cholesterol in the blood to rise. And like you can imagine, hot oil down a cold stovepipe, that would clog up your arteries and cause a heart attack. So this was just an idea called the diet heart hypothesis. But Ancel Keys was a very, he had an unshakable confidence in his own beliefs. He was a very aggressive personality, and he was able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association, the premier group advising Americans on how to deal with heart disease at the time, such that in 1961, we have the first advice anywhere in the world to cut back on saturated fat and dietary cholesterol as the single most effective way to prevent heart disease. That's where it all started. We were not fat phobic, particularly until that time. This was the first official advice in the world, like the little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today. And we are suffering the consequences as a result of that.
Thanks so much. So Gary, what evidence having to do with the sort of effects of, we're using the word carbohydrates, but so we're talking about added sugars, we're talking about the carbohydrates that are in plants and foods and things like that, which all have maybe subtly different effects. But I assume at the time, and you've written on this, there was a lot of evidence that was being ignored or at least sidelined as the ascent of Ancel Keys was underway.
Yes, and thank you, Jay. I just want to say one thing first, just to explain sort of how Nina and I got here.
Yeah.
Because there's this, as journalists, you want to understand the basis of movements, beliefs, ideas, and what happens basically is you start going back in time to look at what physicians would call the evidence base of this medical practice. And the further you go back, you don't find it. And so you end up looking to see what other evidence existed, and you end up in these sort of rabbit holes that Nina and I have kind of spent our life in as journalists, where you're in effect the only people who have ever looked at the history of this evidence and the evidence base, and you find it lacking. So that's kind of the basis, and certainly for what happened to me as an investigative health journalist. I was working for the journal Science in the 90s as a very mainstream publication when I did a series of articles for Science, investigative pieces on these questions. And the more I learned, the more you sort of move out of the mainstream. So the point Jay made, when Nina talked about us embracing this dietary fat idea with Ansel Keys in 1961, first officially, what Keys was the question he was trying to answer is, why do we have this apparent heart disease epidemic in America? And while he was doing that, there were British researchers, so the British, because of their empire, which had ended with the Second World War, but the British had physicians, colonial and missionary physicians all around the world, and they all witnessed a very similar phenomenon, which was pretty much what Weston Price was also documenting in his way, which is isolated populations eating their traditional diets didn't have certain traditional Western diseases. They didn't have obesity, they didn't have diabetes, they didn't appear to have heart disease or very low levels of cancer. And when they transitioned to some kind of Western diet, all these Western diseases came with it. And because the British had this network of physicians all around the world, they were trying to answer that question: what's causing the appearance of Western diseases, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, cancer to some extent, in these populations with the Western diet? And the aspect of the Western diet that appears first is sugar and white flour. That was the easiest thing to ship around the world. So while Ansel Keys was beginning to catalyze this movement in the United States, blaming everything on dietary fat, there were very well-respected British nutritionists saying, in effect, it's the carbs.
Yeah. Do you mind if I just add to that point? Because I think it's important to note that also in the United States at the time, there were many people doubting Ansel Keys in the beginning, right? People were speaking up. The head of an NIH agency called NHLBI, he spoke up and said, we really don't have the evidence for this kind of recommendation to the entire American public. The head of the National Academy of Medicine spoke up and said, we have healthy people. Our American citizens are some of the tallest in the world. Do we really want to go off on this experimental diet? And there were people who had gone, such as George Mann from Vanderbilt University, who had gone off, like the British observers around the world. He had gone off to Africa and observed the Maasai warriors being in perfectly good health, which he tested with electrocardiographs despite eating a diet of mainly meat and fat. He came back to the NIH and started criticizing Ansel Keys and lost his research grant. So, I mean, there were critics in the US and all throughout the 1960s and 70s, and that criticism was effectively sort of, I would say, silenced by about 1986.
Wow. So Sally, you talk a lot about the benefits of cholesterol. And of course, any traditional diet, as you've described, is going to be abundant with cholesterol. We've mostly learned either to demonize it or now to sort of demonize certain aspects of it. But you've written really well about the importance of cholesterol, especially for small children brain development. Talk about that.
Yeah, so as the vegetable oil, seed oil industry was growing, and they were masters at advertising.
In fact, say a little bit about the seed oils themselves.
Okay, I think we should start. It all started around 1890 with the invention of the stainless steel roller press, and this allowed them to get seed oils out of seeds like cottonseed, corn, soybeans, and so forth. And these oils are completely new to the human diet. They are polyunsaturated. They're liquid even when you chill them. And that means that they are unstable. They break down, they oxidize easily, and they eventually break down in your body to aldehydes. Think formaldehyde. You eat these oils, that's what they eventually become in your body, formaldehyde. So up to that point, the fats and oils that had been consumed by people all over the world were animal fats and fruit oils like olive oil, coconut oil, palm oil. So these are stable. They are monounsaturated and saturated. And because our bodies are tropical, 98 degrees, we actually have to have these stable fats in our bodies or the bodies won't work. So what was the question? It's about cholesterol.
Cholesterol.
Okay. Yeah, so this industry grew very strong, and you've never heard of them, the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils, the most powerful lobbying group in America. And they said, how can we demonize our competition? Our competition is butter and lard, and they have something that vegetable oils don't have. They have saturated fat, and they have cholesterol. So that's how we got this idea that these were bad. Cholesterol is absolutely essential. It's essential for reproduction. All of our sex hormones are made out of cholesterol. Did you know that testosterone is made out of cholesterol? Do you really want to avoid it? Do you really want to lower your cholesterol? The brain is full of cholesterol. The cells lining your digestive tract are very rich in cholesterol. Otherwise, you can't digest food very well. And so where was I? Cholesterol.
Cholesterol.
Yeah, so we need cholesterol for reproduction. And then what's very interesting is mother's milk, all milk, is very high in cholesterol. It's about, a baby gets about 6 times more cholesterol than an adult eating a regular diet would get. And that's because babies can't make cholesterol, and mother's milk is very rich in cholesterol and contains special enzymes that ensure 100% absorption of this cholesterol. And that's because babies, they can't make it, so they have to get it from the milk, and they need it for the development of their brain, their digestive tract. You know, all the problems we're seeing today can be attributed to lack of cholesterol in the infant diet. There's no cholesterol in formula, okay? Also, babies make sex hormones, and a baby boy, the first 6 months of life, has cholesterol levels as high as those of an adult male. This programs him to express male characteristics at puberty, and he cannot make those hormones unless he's getting cholesterol from his mother's milk, from raw milk in some way, or we also recommend egg yolks for the babies so they get plenty of cholesterol. If your baby is on formula in this country, it's made with skim milk. There's no cholesterol in the formula.
Wow.
So you can connect the dots there.
So let's step back, Nina and Gary. I'd like to just fill out the details of Ansel Keys' argument. He famously studied a bunch of different countries and didn't sort of disclose all the details. But I mean, how did this idea, because Sally's mentioned that, okay, yeah, there are of course lobbying and industry interests, and in all these things, there's a kind of cartel involved. It's, you know, it's multifactorial. But of course, Ansel Keys had this very specific idea that he thought he had detected by studying these countries. So either or both of you kind of fill that in for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you try to explain why the science went wrong. You can obviously blame there are many corporate interests, and the food interests, and the pharmaceutical interests, but there was also, I believe, a genuine belief by Ansel Keys and his colleagues that they were right about this idea, and that was based on the most ambitious, earliest nutrition study called the 7-country study that he started conducting in the late 1950s, and it was in 7 countries around the world, and about 12,000 men, only men that he studied. And it's fair to say that he set out to prove his hypothesis rather than sort of coming at it as a scientist would, saying, keeping an open mind, right? And we know that because I think it's also fair to say that he cherry-picked his countries. He chose countries where, such as Greece and Yugoslavia, where they had been ruined by the war and their food supply had been destroyed or disturbed, and so they had very low levels of animal foods in their diets, and he avoided, and they had low rates of heart disease. And he avoided countries like Switzerland, France, Germany, who ate a lot of saturated fats and also had low rates of heart disease. So both Gary and I really go into detail about this study in our book. And in 2004, there were more than 1 million citations of this study. So you understand it's like the big boom of nutrition science. It was the most important study that everybody refers back to, but essentially we can't trust its conclusions. And Ansel Keys himself sort of distanced himself from some of the conclusions later on in his life.
So Gary, talk a bit about this, the sort of dynamic of scientific organizations, health organizations that end up promoting these things. Because I think the ordinary American's question would be, well, okay, one guy had this one hypothesis, but presumably in science you let 1,000 flowers bloom. That doesn't seem to be what happened in this case.
Yeah, back in the 1950s, 1960s, all this research was new. This idea that chronic disease could be caused by diet was a new idea. The NIH had just started funding research like this. The field was full of young researchers, young physicians who flooded into the field to try and answer questions. And what happens is you get one dominant personality, in this case Ansel Keys, and one dominant hypothesis. So the dietary fat idea becomes a dominant hypothesis. The National Institutes of Health thinks we're going to test this, so they start funding clinical trials. And the trials actually are, at best, the results are ambiguous. At worst, it's possible that diets they would run studies where they'd randomize subjects to either saturated fat-rich diet or a polyunsaturated fat-rich diet, and the people eating the saturated fat-rich diet might have a little less heart disease, but the people eating the polyunsaturated fat diet had a little more cancer. And so through the 1960s, the researchers doing these studies would say, we can't advise a low saturated fat diet if we're going to raise cancer risk. So the National Institutes of Health continues to fund studies on this one idea. And finally, by the 1984, they have a drug trial that lowers cholesterol called the Lipid Research Center's clinical, yeah. And the world basically flips. So you have this hypothesis that says if we eat too much saturated fat, raises our cholesterol, we get heart disease. And you do a drug trial that lowers cholesterol, you get a tiny influence on heart disease. And the National Institutes of Health are worried about this heart disease epidemic in America. We see this today with a lot of issues that are very controversial, and they overreact. And they say the whole country should go on a low-fat diet. The cover of Time magazine is cholesterol now. The bad news, was that it? Picture of it's for a drug study. The cover is a very famous cover. It's a white plate with 2 fried eggs as the eyes and bacon as the mouth, and they interpret this as relative to diet, and we end up with this, again, dogma we've been living with since, so we should all eat low-fat, low-saturated fat diets to keep our LDL cholesterol low, and this is the most important thing. But by focusing only on that one hypothesis, they ignored all the other developments in the field, and this is a fundamental problem with bad science. So as they're trying to study that, putting all the money into studying that idea, other researchers, particularly led by a fellow named Gerald Reaven at Stanford University, and you're going to hear a lot about this idea in the second panel, we're implicating not LDL cholesterol and heart disease, but high levels of the hormone insulin and a condition called insulin resistance. And that was all related, once again, to the carbohydrate content of the diet and the work that these British had been doing. So that always gets sort of relegated to a minor issue so we can focus on the only thing they wanted to study at the time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you're saying, Gary, which is a really important point that, people are very focused on getting their blood cholesterol down. We're told to do that by our doctors. And essentially what Gary is describing here is an NIH trial that found a benefit from lowering cholesterol with drugs, but that benefit has never been seen in when you lower your cholesterol with diet. So there's been a lot of clinical trials on diet where on average they lowered the cholesterol by about 30, which is significant. So they were following this low saturated fat diet, but those clinical trials universally showed that it made no difference in terms of dying from heart disease or dying from anything else. So that's a really critically important point.
And so I want to turn to carbohydrates. Okay, Gary, I want to get to carbohydrates, but not right away, because this is the sort of the undiscussed topic. But Sally, I want to turn to you because you talk a lot about nutrient density, and so the categories: so fat, protein, and carbohydrates. Those are the macronutrients, and then the micronutrients is all that other stuff. And a lot of people think, well, I mean, why does it matter how micronutrient dense a food is? Because we can just take vitamins for that.
The 3 vitamins that were highest in these traditional diets were A, D, and K2, which we get from animal fats and organ meats and certain seafood. The vitamin A is kind of demonized. It's kind of on the outs because they say it's toxic, and the vitamin is toxic. You need to get it from food. These vitamins need to be taken together because they all work together. And our best sources of vitamin A are butter. Butter is most easily absorbed vitamin A, and liver, which up to the Second World War, Americans ate liver once a week because the doctors told them to. So those are our 2 vitamin A foods. There are a couple of things that will deplete vitamin A very quickly. One is taking vitamin D. If you're in there, people are taking 10,000 units of vitamin D, that'll wipe out your vitamin A very quickly because your bodies will take that vitamin A to use the vitamin D, and then you run out. The other thing that depletes vitamin A is lean meat. When you eat lean meat without the fat, without any vitamin A, your liver releases vitamin A. To use the protein, you need vitamin A to assimilate protein, and you very quickly run out of vitamin A. And this is a scientific, we like to see the scientific validation of traditional foodways. Traditional cultures never ate lean meat. If they hunted animals selectively to get the fattest animals, they wanted the older buffalo with the big hump of fat on the back. If the Aboriginal killed a kangaroo and it was too lean, it was called rubbish and it was thrown away. They hunted animals selectively to get them fattest. So this is one of our basic rules at the Waste and A Price Foundation. You never eat lean meat. You always eat meat with the fat.
Now, you talked about liver again. Okay, that's no more liver drops in there. Yeah,
liver drops, yeah.
But of course, if people don't eat liver, I know you strongly advocate cod liver oil, which I must have been right at the end as a Gen Xer because I remember a little bit of it as a child. But that's a good, you think that's a good source of the
Yes, we recommend not the cod liver oil just off the shelf in the drugstore. That's been heated many times, and the fats are very fragile in cod liver oil. There are 4 brands we recommend. They're on our website, and they're all unheated. So that's what you want. And again, Americans took their cod liver oil. It was a very successful public health campaign. Up to the Second World War, you got cod liver oil in school. Your mom gave it to you. You went to Sunday school. They gave you cod liver oil in Sunday school. So yes, we're the cod liver oil people, and that gives you that A and D together. So that's the way to get your vitamin D.
Terrific.
And it's a food. It's not a vitamin. It's a food.
Okay, so we've done a lot on fat. So let's turn to this other macronutrient because, of course, people have to eat something. And so, then, if people are told eat a lot less fat, stay away from the saturated fat, you're going to add something. So, Nina, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty simple. If you take away eggs and bacon for breakfast, you're going to replace it with cereal and orange juice, and so which are grains, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is the general term. I mean, we basically, all the foods that we eat except for sugar are composed of protein, 3 macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrate. So if you're cutting back on protein and fat, which are in animal foods, you have to shift to carbohydrates. And in fact, that's what Americans did. We no longer use the food pyramid, but that food pyramid that we all remember, the big bottom slab, was all grains, starches, bread. And so between 1970 and 2014, we increased our carbohydrates by 30% as a portion of total calories. And if this insulin hypothesis that you're going to talk about in the next panel is true, those carbohydrates, they all become sugar when you eat them, and they cause a chain of events that leads to metabolic diseases, which is what we see has happened in America.
Yes, and so Gary, respond to this, because I know a lot of people listening may think we tend to all, I get taught this in the first grade. Fat has 9 calories per gram, whereas carbohydrates and protein is only 4. And so if it's all about calories, right, you're going to maybe prefer the stuff with the fewer calories per gram. And so it treats the human body as if it's this simple kind of thermodynamic machine in which just this kind of energy input is the only story. But what's wrong with that mental picture?
Everything. I'm still trying to get over whether or not I can tell my wife that, yes, I can have chopped liver in the house despite how it smells, because Sally insists.
Oh, and the cod liver oil is exotic too.
You make the pate with brandy, if that's any consolation.
I don't make, I buy. Store, it's a different lifestyle. Sorry, and when I got into this, my first experience getting into this investigative article I did for Science on dietary fat back in 1999, I was meeting with a assistant director of health at NIH. We met at a Starbucks in Potomac, and very, no garages open at the time. And he literally told me, he said, back in 1984, we didn't actually know when we told people to go on this low-fat diet that it would prevent heart disease, because the research was, never demonstrated that. But we were sure people would get thinner because there are fewer calories per gram in carbohydrates and protein than there are in fat. And he said, lo and behold, we experienced an obesity epidemic, and people started eating more carbs and they got fatter. And that conversation launched my career.
Wow.
So when you start, one of the things I've done in the course of my research is studying the history of obesity science, and it turns out, and this hormone insulin that you secrete in response to the carbohydrates in the diet and also to the protein in the lean meat, because 60% of the amino acids, pardon the scientific terminology, are converted to glucose. So. Anyway, there's a reasonable hypothesis that they're going to discuss in the second session that the insulin levels drive fat accumulation. So independent of calories and effects, it's not about how many calories per gram, it's about what these foods are doing to you when you eat them, what hormones are secreted in response, and the hormones that are secreted in response to carbohydrates happen to be hormones that make you store calories as fat. And when I was growing up, and many of you may remember this, there used to be this very simple idea that carbohydrates were fattening. That's what my mother taught me. That's what she believed. That's what their generation believed. But you get this phenomena of trading off one food for another that Nina described. And in fact, it's a little bit what Sally and I are discussing, because when she's discussing Weston Price's research, she's discussing the importance of the presence of fat, and I'm discussing the importance of the absence of refined grains and sugars in the same diets. So my focus is the white flour and sugar that these people did not eat are sort of toxic, and by not eating them, they're much healthier, and Sally's focus is the fats they did eat. And once we started telling Americans to eat less fat, as Nina said, they had to replace it with something. And that replacement, that period of years, you can date it from 1977, when there was a report by the McGovern Committee advocating for this, to 1984, when this Lipid Research Center's trial came out and the NIH jumped in, was the period during which the obesity epidemic began.
Wow.
And it could be a coincidence. As Jay said, association doesn't imply causality, but it should be at least reason enough to care that we went from basically fat-rich diets to carb-rich diets. And in this process, sugar became benign. And the sugar industry did a wonderful job at communicating this idea that it's all about the calories. And if it's all about the calories, the only problem with sugar is we like it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually recently came across an old ad that says, sugar will help you reduce your hunger pangs. Yeah. When, I mean, one of the takeaways from what Gary is saying here is that sugar and carbohydrates in general, one of the reasons that they may have caused the obesity and other metabolic disease epidemics is that they spur your hunger. They actually increase your hunger. So, and the low-fat diet, which we thought would reduce calories, because fat, if you bring down fat, you can reduce the calories. It's the fat and the protein that are actually satiating, that keep you from meal to meal without needing to snack. So shifting away from that diet and the food industry introducing a snack culture, like we just snack all day long, that has, I think, had profound consequences. It's that shift, and you if you start your day with breakfast with eggs and bacon for breakfast, you're not hungry until lunch. That's right.
Absolutely. So Sally, let's end with you, and then we'll do some Q&A. You wanted to add something?
I want to
also, I'm going to just give us a minute also on the importance of fermented food, because that's not the topic of our panel, but I just like you to mention that.
All right, first let me say that the human body has lots of fat in it. All our cell membranes are made of fat, and our lung surfactants. Even if we aren't fat, we have a lot of fat in our body. And because we're warm-blooded, that fat needs to be mostly saturated fat to make everything stable. If we are not getting enough saturated fat in a diet, the body has a backup plan, because we need saturated fat so badly for normal function. And that backup plan is to make fats out of carbohydrates. So if you're not eating enough fat, you're going to absolutely crave carbohydrates, and you have to have those carbohydrates or you won't have enough good fat in your body. A very interesting study, quite recent, they got rats addicted to sugar, and then they gave them a diet of 40% lard, and the rats didn't want the sugar anymore. Wow. The researchers couldn't believe it. Another theme of our foundation that we find in literally all traditional cultures is the practice of eating fermented foods, like raw sauerkraut, like kombucha is a fermented food. And these foods provide us with good bacteria in the gut, and there's more good bacteria in a spoonful of sauerkraut that you eat with your dinner than there is in a whole bottle of probiotic pills. So this is something we need to get back in the diet for good digestion.
Terrific. Maybe we'll have a future panel just specifically on that. I thought of it since I'm sitting next to you, so I wanted a little plug. So with that, we've got about 11 minutes for questions, and so if you will raise your hand if you have a question. One request that it actually be a question, so with the question mark right at the end, not a paragraph in a question mark, right? An actual question. And we are also taking questions online, and so let you guys pick. Just whoever you give the mic to. So.
Good morning, Mr. Don.
Yep.
J.P. Hogan. Going back to when you made the policy change towards that, was there a psyche involved? They wanted people to eat less dog-eat-dog world, less predator with all the wars. Were they trying to change the mindset without thinking about the body, or was it all? So is it healthy body, healthy mind? No, let's just change the mind of people during all these war times and make them think like they were eating more peaceably or less animalistic.
There are several angles to that. So for instance, Ansel Keys was a creator of the K-ration, loathed by servicemen in the United States all around the world. And the K-ration was very sugar-rich. And Keys was actually funded by the sugar industry. The sugar industry funded a lot of research during World War II and in that period. So that might have influenced his thinking. I'm not so sure. And then the Seventh-day Adventist community has been very involved in nutrition. They are promote plant-based, if not vegetarian diets, and they, for a century maybe. You might know that history better than I do.
Yeah. Well, they believe that we should all of us should return to what they call the Garden of Eden diet, which is only fruits and vegetables, as a matter of their faith. But I think what you're also talking about is it really emerged in the 1960s with the anti-war movement, that there was this idea that we should make peace, not war, that we were more peaceable, not killing animals, and also we should be peaceable in terms of the distribution of resources. So because a pound of plants is less resource consuming than a pound of meats, so the argument went, we should shift our diet to eating plants. That is an idea that has existed since the early 1900s, and we've seen it grow today.
Right? One of the best-selling diet books of that era was Diet for a Small Planet, which was making this argument that you just can't feed the world on animal products, and so we should eat the grains directly rather than relying on the animals.
One of the characteristics of low B12, and you only get B12 from animal foods, one of the characteristics is a tendency to irrational anger. So it's not necessarily true that this plant-based diet is going to make us all into good people.
All right, I'm not going to comment on that one. We'll just leave that one there. Yes? So if you have the mic, it's up to you who gets to ask the question.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the panel. I had a question, well, two questions technically. One was on the solution side. So how much of it do you think is related to education and educating the public on public health aspects of nutrition? And how much of it is regulation, specifically on high processed foods, for example? And the second question was in relation to the comments that you made about some of the primitive nations, for example, that have high fat, high meat diets, and how much of that diet is also related to the caloric use that they were having, such as exercise, et cetera. So that was my second question.
I guess I can answer the policy regulation one, which is that the most powerful, single most important policy driving what Americans think is a healthy diet is the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's co-issued by USDA and HHS. That determines all the food assistant programs, so school meals, food in hospitals, what the military is told to eat. I mean, all feeding assistance programs for women and infant children, also downloaded to all health professionals, and they deliver those guidelines, which, if you believe that we should be eating more fruits, vegetables, grains, and keeping your animal foods low, that's basically the dietary guidelines for the last, 45 years. So that really needs to change. If we had good advice from the top, I mean, either you have to get rid of it or it has to be right. So that's the change that needs to happen.
And let me add, and then I'll let you get to the
exercise question. I get this all the time.
In a lot of these areas, the research really doesn't exist to make, we're arguing the research didn't exist when we moved to this diet, low-fat, low-saturated fat paradigm, and there was significant research suggesting it was wrong. But because we bought into that, the right studies have never been done to establish really the long-term harms of sugar consumption. For instance, like I personally think the healthiest thing anyone could do in their diet is stop eating sugar, but I can't bet on it. I am betting on it. It's not based on hard research. It's based on historical observation. So on some level, I'm always advocating for, can we just do the kinds of studies we did for dietary fat, where hundreds of millions of dollars were spent looking at, in some cases, decade-long clinical trials. It's going to take some time and some effort, but can we do that with this alternative hypothesis you're going to hear about in the next session?
Sally, you wanted to say something
Yeah,
about
I get this question all the time. These traditional people were slim and robust, and that's because they exercised more, and that's actually something of a myth. They did a time and motion study in Australia comparing the Aboriginals living in the bush and the Aboriginals who moved to the city and were riding bicycles and things. And they found that there was more exercise than the ones who had modernized. The traditional people, of course, the men had periods of intense activity when they were hunting, but they didn't do that every day. The rest of the time they stood around and sharpened their spears and gossiped and laughed, and the women's work was quite sedentary. So this is something of a myth. The other myth about the traditional people was that they lived in this pristine, they had clear air and no pollution. Actually, their environment was very polluted because they lived in tents with lots of smoke. They chose that because it kept the mosquitoes away, and they also burned their fields. And so they were breathing in smoke a lot of the time, but they did not have lung disease. And that's, I believe, attributed to the very high levels of vitamin A in the diet, which protect the lungs.
Can I tell this one?
Yes,
this
absolutely.
Australian study she mentioned, when I was doing my research, I interviewed the woman who led that study. She was from New Zealand, her name was Karen O'Day, and she described she had taken these Aboriginal people from the city, moved them back into the bush so they could live their life, and they were hanging out with other Aboriginals who lived in the bush. And she said some of her colleagues from the city came out to visit, and they went for a jog. And she looked over at the Aboriginals, and they were laughing. And she said to them, "Why are you laughing?" And they said, "Well, the idea that anyone would run voluntarily is just the funniest thing they'd ever seen."
And this is crucial. The point's not that it's a bad idea to exercise. It's the idea that, well, traditional peoples are slim because they get so much exercise is, mostly a myth, unfortunately.
I mean, you have to consider there were no gyms in the United States really until the 70s.
Right.
And so what were we doing? I mean, we led. I'm for exercise, but I think we know pretty well that you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. Diet really drives the diseases.
And the other thing is that heavy exercise depletes vitamin A. So if you are doing heavy exercise, you really need to eat your liver, right?
That's the third time. Okay. Okay, so I'd like one short question. I'm going to warn the panelists, though. I want to do a lightning round right at the end. And I'm going to ask you if you could change one or two things about, federal government policy, whether it be research or guidelines, what would it be? I just want to give you a heads up. Okay, so one more question.
Thanks. This question might actually lead into that. A lot of healthy food is an access problem, especially folks on the, the lower income, spectrum who sometimes have the hardest time accessing this healthy food. What are some things that you might think the government can do, or federal, state, and local, to provide better access to healthy food for folks who need it the most?
That's a perfect setup. So let's just end with that. So the two questions, food access, especially for the poor, and other policies that you think would make a major difference if you could just wave a magic wand.
Yeah, for me, the most important policy change would be lifting the cap on saturated fats in the dietary guidelines. Was never supported by the evidence, as we talked about today. And that is the rate limiting factor on people eating enough meat and dairy to be healthy. So that's the most important change that I think could happen. And regarding access, even before we discuss access, I think it's crucially important to get the advice right from the top so that when people go to the store, they know how to spend their food dollars in a way that will make them healthy. So that's it for me.
That's perfect. Gary?
And I agree with Nina on both points. Just the question, how do we make healthy foods available, which is a critical problem in many areas of the country. But first we have to define what a healthy food is. And what you've been hearing from us is a very different story than you could hear from any random dietitians we pull off the street and pull in here to tell you what the truth is. So somehow we have to establish beyond reasonable doubt whether we're right in effect, and what a healthy food is and what an unhealthy food is. And one of the primary ways we manage to get people to quit smoking is to establish beyond reasonable doubt that it causes lung cancer. And once we did, people knew the price of continuing. So again, I keep coming back to somehow we have to do the science to establish what a healthy food really is and what an unhealthy food really is.
Absolutely. Sally?
Well, I guess I'm the incurable optimist. I'm heartened by what I see in our local food line in a little town, kind of a redneck rural area. There's pastured butter. This is in the food line. There's pastured eggs. You can get grass-fed meat, and you can get some organic food. You can get kombucha. So things are, none of this would have been there 10 years ago. So things are changing, and I think just the ideas that we're talking about today, they need to trickle down. And by the way, what is the most economical meat that you can buy in the supermarket? Liver.
Because nobody wants it.
Yeah, that's a supply and demand thing, yeah.
The handsomest man that ever came into our store was African American, the broadest smile and straightest teeth you've ever seen. And so, of course, I asked him, what did you eat growing up? He said, we ate lots of liver because it was cheap.
Wow. All right, so we end with liver. Please join me in thanking our panel. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Jennifer Ghilardi, who is actually a senior policy analyst in the DeVos Center with me, and was actually the first person that Heritage hired specifically working on a Restoring American Wellness initiative. Jennifer?
Hey everyone, thank you for coming to this conversation, which I think really lays the groundwork for all the other MAHA issues. If we don't get this right, nothing else will work. So really appreciate you being here. I am just going to get right into the second panel because we have lots to talk about. Our first guest today is Benjamin Bickman, PhD. And do we have the, okay, they're coming up, the pictures. I just want to note that our events pointed out we had a hard time getting all of their acronyms and all of their research under here, so you can be sure you are getting information from some really well-educated people. Dr. Bickman is a nationally renowned metabolic scientist and professor at Brigham Young University and holds his PhD in bioenergetics from East Carolina University. Bickman completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Duke National University of Singapore, where he specialized in metabolic disorders. He is a recognized expert on insulin resistance. His research is focused on how insulin elevation and nutrition contribute to chronic disease such as obesity. He is the author of the best-selling book, Why We Get Sick, as well as How Not to Get Sick. I think that's something we all want to know. In addition to being a guest on several well-known podcasts, Dr. Bickman also hosts his own podcast entitled The Metabolic Classroom, which I recommend you all listen to. Some great information in there. Dr. Richard Johnson is a board-certified professor of medicine in kidney disease, infectious diseases, and internal medicine at the University of Colorado. Dr. Johnson is internationally recognized and highly cited for his research on the causes of diabetes and obesity. He is the founding editor of one of the leading textbooks on kidney disease, Comprehensive Clinical Nephrology. That's a word I did not know until joining this movement and our guests here at Heritage, and is often featured in prestigious medical journals. His two best-selling books, The Sugar Fix and The Fat Switch, and his research in the role of fructose and uric acid are continuously referenced in contemporary health literature. His awards, accolades, and patents are numerous and a testament to his dedication to the field. Dr. David Lugwood is co-director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center and serves as the professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He received a PhD and an MD from the Stanford University of Medicine and completed a fellowship in pediatric endocrinology. I told you there is like a lot of technical stuff to get. This is like the hardest intro or speech I've ever done just because the list of accomplishments. He completed a fellowship in pediatric endocrinology as well as an internship and residency in pediatrics from Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Ludwig's research emphasizes the outcomes of nutrition on body weight, metabolism, and hormone balance. He founded the Optimal Weight for Life, OWL, program at the Boston Children's Hospital and is the principal investigator on multiple grants from the NIH. He has written 3 books for the masses, including Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry. Yes, I am pretty much always hungry, so I'm looking forward to how we can resolve that. And the cookbook, Always Delicious. Additionally, he has produced over 150 scientific articles, serving as a contributing author for the Journal of the American Medical Association. Please welcome all of these very distinguished gentlemen onto the stage. Okay, well, I think that was the hardest part of this for me, was getting all of that out. I thought I knew a lot about nutrition until I started listening to all of your podcasts, reading all of your work. I couldn't possibly get through it all. So I think the biggest challenge today is going to distill all of your knowledge down and make it accessible for people. But you all have books and have all do kind of podcasts, so you are used to that. So Jay had mentioned in the previous panel with our panelists, kind of that a calorie is not a calorie. And I've heard specifically Dr. Bickman and Dr. Ludwig, you say that directly. Is there anything you wanted to add to that conversation of why a calorie is not a calorie and what the distinction is? Go ahead.
Sure. So this concept, a calorie is a calorie, is conventionally used to make the argument that it doesn't matter what you eat in terms of macronutrients. We've heard what macronutrients are: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. That the same number of calories from any food will produce the same biological responses, will produce the same amount of weight gain or loss based on your calorie intake and your needs. The problem is that that defies literally a century of research to indicate that the type of foods we eat, independent of calories, have profound effects on hormones throughout the body, metabolism, and even the expression of our genes. So the key way to understand this clinically is whether the same number of calories can produce weight gain or weight loss under different conditions. In animals, experimental animals, that's clearly the case. In fact, in some models of animal obesity, one that's very famous called leptin deficiency. This is a hormone that's affected by our diet, by carbohydrates. The leptin deficient animal is in a state of permanent starvation. And so even if restricted to half the calories that a normal animal would eat, it still becomes too fat. So the debate is whether these phenomena, which are well accepted in the laboratory, apply to humans without genetic defects. And I think the research from us suggests that that is the case, that the number of calories you eat can affect, the type of calories you eat can affect the number of calories you burn in a way that has everything to do with the success or failure of a weight loss diet. And that's what the debate has mostly been in nutrition today.
Yeah, I think I could add to that. And so it turns out that most of the time in nature, animals will regulate their weight so that if they eat too much on one day, they'll balance it out over the week. And what happens is their weight may go up a little bit, but it always comes back to where it should be. And in fact, animals that hibernate will purposely gain weight in the fall before they hibernate. And so it turns out that weight is tightly regulated for the needs of the animals. And there's even studies in humans suggesting that we try to regulate our weight. And when we're young, we're particularly good at regulating weight. You can eat all you want when you're 12 years old, and you're not really going to become overweight as quickly as you would if you were 50. And so the issue is, calories are calories, but our weight regulates to help prevent us from gaining weight. And what our research focused on is that what really makes the difference is to disrupt the weight regulation. And if you disrupt weight regulation, like with your leptin deficient animal, then you're hungry and you keep eating and you'll gain weight. And what we found was that carbs were the driver of that dysregulation, and particularly fructose, which is a component of sugar. And we found that when we disrupted appetite, animals would gain weight. And calories do count. Once you can't regulate weight, the more calories you eat, the fatter you'll get. And high-fat diets in a disrupted situation, like if you're eating sugar with fat, the sugar disrupts the regulation of weight, and then the fat, it becomes the fodder to drive the weight gain. So if you're on a low-carb diet, if you're on a keto diet, you can eat all the fat you want. You're not going to gain weight because weight is regulated, because it's the carbs that have a key role in regulating the appetite. And so you know, that's so a calorie. And in fact, there is a calorie-independent mechanism with sugar too, so that if you put an animal on a low-calorie diet, but it's high in sugar, they won't gain so much weight because they're on a low-calorie diet, but they'll develop fat in their tissues, they'll get fatty liver, they'll become diabetic, they'll develop hypertension.
Maybe the skinny fat thing.
Yeah,
that we
yeah,
talked
absolutely.
About,
Skinny fat. So anyway, I've done my little spiel there.
Well, I'll have my own brief spiel. In a way, it's almost comical that we talk about these heat units when it comes to understanding the origins of human obesity. Very briefly, the whole idea of calories is born from the effort to find the most perfect steam engine, all these ideas of thermodynamics. And I hate to break it to the crowd, we're more complicated than steam engines. And it is laughable. If I drink a cup of hot chocolate, is that more fattening than that same cup if I let it cool off? Why am I talking about calories? Now, not to say that the mass that we're eating doesn't matter, but I actually think that once the concept of thermodynamics worked itself into biology, we lost the script. I think you could almost point to that moment of saying we now have forgotten what we were actually attempting to study, which is this complicated union of a lot of concepts. Yes, some biochemistry. Yes, those carbons that we're calling calories. But yes, also to the composition of those carbons. And then most importantly, I would add the endocrine effect. So what is the signal that these foods that I'm calling calories are going to tell my body to do with them? Is it telling my body to store that energy, or what we're calling energy, or is it going to enable my body to burn it?
What's interesting is I think we see this across issues in our country, that we're just these material things made up of chemicals. And we're taking that approach to so many things, to psychiatrics, to our metabolism. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this now that we've laid the groundwork. Can you explain, Dr. Bickman, the relationship between glucose and insulin, and maybe the next one for you, Dr. Richards? I'm sorry, I want to call you by your first name, and I was Rick. Okay, because you said Rick, and then go further into, you mentioned fructose, the difference between fructose and glucose. So let's start with that glucose-insulin relationship, and then go to fructose and glucose.
Yeah, in fact, let's get casual. I have 7 older brothers, and getting too much respect makes me very uncomfortable.
Okay.
So yeah, glucose and insulin, I actually think that because we have lumped the two together so much in conventional conversation, we've actually done insulin a disservice. And that's because we have a glucose-centric paradigm of the body and healthcare and certainly metabolism. But the reality is we should have an insulin-centric paradigm. Insulin is a hormone that is unique because in its particular class of hormone, there are not many that can do what insulin does, which is namely affects every single cell of the body, from brain cells to bone cells, lung cells to liver cells, and all of those other cells in between. Insulin will come to those cells and tell it to do something. It will knock on a door and then send a signal to that cell. Most people only think of the glucose component of it, where they think that insulin's only job is to knock on the door of a cell, like the muscle or the fat cells, and then tell the cell to open its doors to allow the glucose to come in. And that is something that happens, but it really sells insulin short, because there are many cells where insulin is not necessary to have the cell bring in some glucose to metabolize it. But every cell needs insulin's signal to tell it what to do with energy. So now I'm getting a little off the topic, but to bring the answer back to your question, insulin's primary stimulus, so what will tell the pancreas to make insulin, will be a rise in blood glucose levels. And then insulin's most famous effect will be to lower that blood glucose, but that doesn't mean it's its only effect. Insulin does many, hundreds of things at different cells throughout the body, but the thematic effect is that it will tell the cell what to do with energy. To some degree, it will tell it, are you growing, are you shrinking? In that process, I need you to use energy in some way. Mostly, insulin's primary signal is to tell the body to store energy.
So if someone were looking at their blood tests, right, I want to make it like practical for people. Someone gets blood tests back.
Oh, yeah.
Should
Don't
they
rely
not
on
be
the
concerned
glucose.
on glucose because
Well,
it's a
not
snapshot?
that, yeah, not that you shouldn't be concerned with it, but this is a perfect application of how the principle has gone wrong, where because we have conflated insulin and glucose, we think that one can be an indicator of the other, and that is absolutely not true. Indeed, to put a fine point on it, the single most common health problem in the world is a problem called insulin resistance, and that is an instance where glucose levels can be normal, but insulin levels will not be. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of the conversation. We've not even defined what insulin resistance is, but suffice it to say, it's a situation where insulin levels can still be normal. Thus, it stays clinically silent because our glucose-centric paradigm determines that everything's fine. If we have a paradigm that at least encompasses insulin, not even to exclude glucose, then all of a sudden we can detect the problem. So insulin levels are the metabolic canary in the coal mine. That's going to be the early warning. So if someone's getting a blood test and they find that their glucose levels are normal, but they have PCOS in women, or even erectile dysfunction, or high blood sugar, or rather a high fatty liver, hypertension, early cognitive decline, those are not glucose problems. To a degree, they're insulin problems, so we need to measure the insulin.
Okay, and we'll get back to some of those results from all of this, so bookmark
Good.
that. Yes.
I'm
Maybe
ready.
just one comment about
Sure.
the insulin resistance
Sure.
to give an analogy. So you could think of people use different metaphors or analogies, lock and key, but I like to think of this as a river that's delivering water downstream that serves many purposes, keeps agriculture going, people can drink enough water, everything is fine. Until some tree limbs and brush start building up at a bottleneck and begin to restrict the flow of water. Now, you may still get water downstream, but perhaps not enough, so blood sugar might start rising. But the other problem is that pooling of water upstream starts to flood into other areas. And these are the effects that Ben was talking about that influence how the blood vessels function, how the brain functions, the liver. So that excess in water upstream, insulin resistance, producing extra insulin before it gets down doing its main functions, can cause a whole set of other metabolic problems. And so we suffer in both directions. And that's a paradigm that's not commonly understood or recognized, certainly not seen by standard blood tests.
That was very helpful. I think the imagery is always a good metaphor, is spot on. So glucose, fructose,
Yeah,
what's the difference?
so let me first excellent points by both of you. When it comes to metabolic problems, there is this situation where people develop a condition that kind of precedes the development of frank obesity and high blood pressure and diabetes. And it's called the metabolic syndrome. And this is kind of the beginning. And part of the metabolic syndrome is you start getting weight in your abdomen, and you start developing higher blood pressure, and your blood glucose starts to creep up a little bit, and you develop insulin resistance and elevated triglycerides and other lipids or fats in your blood. And it's the big precursor to diabetes, to high blood pressure, to frank obesity, to diseases, behavioral conditions, to Alzheimer's disease. All these bad diseases usually begin with this development of metabolic syndrome, and 25 to 30% of the US adult population have this, and it's the problem. So if we can understand what drives that and prevent that, we can have a huge impact. And one of the key features of that syndrome is that insulin levels are high, even when you're fasting. And those insulin, as Ben has pointed out, can drive a lot of these processes. So many people say, well, the problem is the insulin resistance. Why are insulin levels going up? Why are we gaining weight? And the answer from all the research that I've done, and it has been that it's carbs. And when you eat carbs, they stimulate insulin for a short period of time, but then the insulin levels come back down. But you're chronically eating a lot of carbs, your insulin levels start to creep up, and you start developing the syndrome. And our work suggested that the carbs are broken down to glucose, which stimulates insulin, but some of the glucose gets converted in our body to fructose. And also we can get fructose directly by drinking soft drinks or sugar or high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is really, it's more it's 55% of it is fructose, basically. And so we found that fructose drives this syndrome. And when we blocked the metabolism of fructose in animals, we could block this syndrome. And the fructose only comes from carbs. You get it from glucose, and you get it from sugar or high glycemic carbs. And the basic problem are foods that raise glucose levels, because when the glucose levels go up in your blood, that's when you convert to fructose. And so things like cereal, which we're giving to the kids, the frosted flakes, juices, bread, potatoes, rice, and sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and most processed foods have a lot of this in it. And so we can show that is the mechanism that disrupts the weight regulation, induces insulin resistance, drives up blood pressure, induces inflammation. It's the driver. It's the principal driver. So if we could just reduce carbs, especially high glycemic carbs and sugar, we could have a huge impact. We could have a huge impact on our population.
So I want to jump in here, skip some of my questions, because is there any concern we're going to go from a demonizing fat and cholesterol to demonizing carbohydrates, and that there's no place for sweet potatoes, carrots, some of these what we've come to learn as higher glycemic fruits and vegetables, berries? And I understand, there's been talk, well, fruit wasn't actually this sweet, particularly with apples and things like that we used to have crab apples, which were a little more tart, and now we've engineered them to be these sweet things. But what about potatoes? And is there any fear of that, of swinging too far the other direction?
I'm sure someone could make the case there is, but if we're going to demonize anything, at least let's exercise the right one. I think that there could be different levels of concern. My simple approach to it is that my view as a metabolic scientist is, how can you nourish the body while keeping insulin levels generally under control? Because chronic and frequent elevations in insulin, I submit, is the most relevant common driver of insulin resistance. It's a fundamental biological principle that too much of something will result in a resistance to that something. That's not to say it's the only driver. But with that view in mind, my simple approach is if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, it's probably one to avoid when it comes to carbohydrates. That whole fruits and vegetables especially, I'm generally pretty indifferent to or even favorable to, but that's not drinking them, it's eating them. So whole fruits and vegetables to me are fine, but I also don't mind if someone wants to start to categorize it out further. For me, at least kind of a policy, big 30,000-foot view, if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, it's one to avoid. Otherwise, I say generally enjoy.
Yeah, I think that you asked exactly the right question. Do we go from demonizing one macronutrient to demonizing another? And I'll make a confession that I did have potatoes and fruit yesterday for dinner.
Shame.
I'd also like to say that I'm been a contrarian throughout my career and has focused on the problems with dietary carbohydrate, and with Gary Taubes and others, helped develop something called the carbohydrate insulin model. But that said, first off, not all carbohydrates are going to be public enemy number one. Many populations have eaten carbohydrate-rich diets and maintain good metabolic health. They tend not to be what's called high glycemic load, very rapidly digesting, so they digest slowly, so there isn't the same surge and crash in blood sugar and elevation of insulin. But these populations also tend to be very physically active, which gives them insulin sensitivity to manage the carbohydrate. The problem is that most of the American population is not metabolically healthy. We're sedentary, stressed, we don't get enough sleep. That creates this bedrock of metabolic dysfunction. We're overweight or we have obesity. On top of that, the carbohydrates are a real problem. It's like the problem in philosophy, the irresistible force hitting the immobile object, and that produces the meltdown into diabetes that we've seen. On the other side, so carbohydrates are a particular problem in America. The other side of the argument, and I'm going to be show a little daylight with my friends Nina and Gary and perhaps a few others on saturated fat. I don't think that saturated fat gets a full pass. There are some saturated fatty acids like palmitic acid, which are highly inflammatory and produce insulin resistance, especially with a high carbohydrate diet. The way I integrate these things is to consider how they interact. On a high carbohydrate diet, insulin goes up, and the first thing that insulin does is suppress fat burning, fat oxidation. And so the saturated fats that you eat on a high carbohydrate diet, so a dessert that has cream and flour, for example, butter and flour, sugar, that combination is not good because the insulin will prevent the saturated fat from being oxidized. Jeff Volek showed this well. Saturated fat builds up in the blood, and it causes metabolic problems. But on a low carbohydrate diet, that doesn't happen. The saturated fats get burned off. They don't stick around to cause problems. So I would say, maybe to answer your question, we need a more of a nuanced view as to how these nutrients interact. It's the worst combination is to dump saturated fat, to say it's fine to eat as much saturated fat as you want on a typical American diet. I think the research is pretty clear that's not a good thing. But where do we focus? Do we focus on the bread or the butter? And I think I would agree with everybody else. The bread is the place to start.
So it's really about meeting the moment of where we are right now. This may not have been necessary 100 years ago, but because of this standard American diet or the SAD diet, this is where we need to go now to reverse some of these chronic issues.
And the baseline metabolic dysfunction, the obesity and metabolic dysfunction, which does set up this firestorm, which is only fueled by the carbohydrates.
Yeah, I would like to add 3 points. The first point is that Not all carbs are bad. There are a lot of good carbs, as Gary has talked about in his books. You know, the carbs that raise glucose up in the blood tend to be the bad ones that really drive glucose up. And things like vegetables are very healthy in general. And even the things like carrots that contain a small amount of fructose, it turns out that the body will inactivate like the first 5 grams of fructose that come in. So vegetables in general are great. Fruit, my second point is fruit. Fruit, although it contains sugar and fructose, also contains, you know, antioxidants, vitamin C, all these things that are actually very, very healthy. And I'm a pro on eating fruit. You know, you don't want to eat a huge amount. You don't want to drink fruit juice that is concentrated sugars. But the benefits of fruit are real. And we even did a study where we did a low fructose or low sugar diet with fruit supplements, and they actually did better if they had fruit supplements. And then the third problem is that what the real problem is for our society is that we're eating, you know, 55% of our diet is carbs. And this is the problem because we're inundating ourselves with breads and cereals and all these things that, and sugar. And, you know, maybe 15% of our diet is sugar. Some people, 25% of their diet is sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And this is really horrible. And that's where we should be targeting, is to bring the carb content down a bit, but to really reduce the sugars and the high glycemic carbs like bread and cereal.
So we've mentioned kind of carbs and a lower carb move towards a lower carbohydrate diet. How would you define low carb? We look at grams. Are we looking at intuition? You know, how do we measure low carb? And is there a population for which it doesn't really matter if you're a normally healthy person? And I guess we have to define healthy, right? Because you had mentioned we can be thin and still have pre-diabetes and some of these other chronic diseases. But so first, what constitutes low carb? What's the measurement? And then also, is there a population for which this might not be necessary?
So the last point first, actually, I had many thoughts while you teed up that question, one of which is that the idea that different people can store fat in healthier ways. But I don't think I want to get onto that. Like, why is it that women are fatter than men and yet healthier in every cardiometabolic outcome? Why is it that Caucasians are fatter than their East Asian counterparts and yet in the beautiful country of Singapore, diabetes rates are higher than we have here? So there are very stark differences across individuals in how they store their fat that becomes problematic. But that's not what you asked.
I am going to, by the way. So hold that thought. I'll get there. I'll get there.
Yes. So I actually am pulling a Sally, and I forgot what you'd asked.
Okay. How do we measure low carb?
I started thinking about
what's the measurement of low carb?
So right, I said I was gonna answer the last part of the question first. I think the more physically active someone is, the more they have wiggle room to get away with whatever they want. That's one of the reasons why I find some frustrating conversations online where you have very lean, very physically active people going on sugar diets. Well, those people can do whatever they want, and they're metabolically impervious, it seems, although you have instances of marathon runners being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, so they're not as bulletproof
heart disease
as
too.
they think. That's right. Yeah, so suffice it to say, though, if there's sufficient outlet, and exercising muscles are hungry for anything, glucose included, so if you have a bigger outlet for that, you can get away with it more. So I don't like to necessarily come to a hard, fast rule, but that is where something like ketones become an objective marker, where, not to invoke too much biochemistry of the body here, but where glucose is coming in and the insulin response, responding, as David mentioned, one of insulin's first things it does will inhibit the breakdown or the burning of fat. And you only make ketones when you burn fat. Ketones are nothing more, nothing less than products of a lot of fat burning happening in a body. So that can be used as a bit of a threshold, an objective marker as to, am I eating enough glucose within a certain period of time, or carbs within a certain period of time, to shift my body out of fat burning. Now, some people might be fine with that, and they will say, that's fine, I don't mind if I'm carb or sugar burning because I'm burning a lot. But there are instances where if a person is, I submit, overweight and has pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, or certainly if they've been told they have insulin resistance because they have a clinical team who knows how to measure the right markers, I would say one way of describing that scenario is you're a little intolerant to carbohydrates. Some people will eat one load of carbohydrate and have a significantly higher glycemic and insulinogenic response than someone else. Now, there are a handful of variables that play into that, but although none of which we can really measure. And so that's why we're left with these more broad perspectives of, well, are you overweight? Do you have hypertension? Do you have prediabetes or fatty liver disease or infertility? Those all are derivative of a metabolic dysfunction, which to me means metabolic dysfunction means insulin resistance. If that person fits that profile, I think it's prudent to say you don't handle carbohydrates very well, so you should go lower. And I'm remembering your question being, well, what is low? I'm not going to give a number because I think it just depends. If a person is interested in ketogenic because of certain pathologies, they need it to control their migraines or their epilepsy or their cognitive decline. They want to keep that in check. Then it's typically going to be around the range of about 50 grams. But for the young...
A day?
A day. Yep. But for the young physically active individual, it can be much higher. I knew an individual who was training for an Ironman triathlon. He would eat 300 grams of carbs a day and be in deep ketosis the next morning. Wow. He just was burning so much. So it's hard for me to come to a definitive amount. It would just depend on the person.
I think you highlight, too, the importance of a doctor-patient, and that some of this is very individual. And in case anyone missed it, I don't think I have to ask the question of what are some of the symptomologies of metabolic dysfunction. I think you've heard them: mental decline, cognitive decline, obesity, diabetes, maybe even cancer. So I'll kind of gloss over, but I did want to point out that within their answers, they're pointing to all of these things.
Ben is certainly right to bring up the subtleties of difference between people, and it's also helpful to have just a practical clinical guideline. So to answer your question, most people in the US are eating between 45 and 55% carbs. Back in the low-fat era, we were told to eat 60% or more, and there are actually some populations that are up to 70, 75%. But in the US, it's 45 to 55%. So a low-carb diet, I would say, begins at less than 40%. That was the sort of the classic Mediterranean diet. A very low-carb diet goes, usually when you get below 20 to 25%, I would call that a very low carbohydrate diet. And then a ketogenic diet starts at around 10% of carbohydrates, which is oftentimes 50 grams, 75 grams, varying a lot based on individual needs. But it's helpful to have these sort of guidelines so we can provide broad guidance to the public, but also for research studies. I think that all of us have bemoaned these studies that claim to show adverse effects of a low-carb diet when people are actually eating 45% as opposed to 55%. There's really very little difference there. And how do they call that a low or a very low-carb diet?
Yeah. So I know you all are scientists. I do want to shift a little bit into policy and some other questions. And specifically in your field, do you find that there's bias, either culturally, academically, industry-driven, that shapes the way low-carb research is received by the scientific community, the science, follow the science people, and as well as by the public?
Oh gosh, yes. It's complicated. Even in my own career, just as a personal aside, during the time where I was getting tenure, I had the dietetics department actually try to get me fired because they considered my ideas so problematic. And indeed, the accusation was that Professor Bickman's teaching principles that oppose science. Ironically, of between the accusers and me, only one of us was actually publishing peer-reviewed work, but they couldn't be bothered by that fact, and I had to defend my job. It was actually a really worrying time. We just had a new little baby. I was looking at what am I going to tell my dear wife that my heretical ideas are going to get me fired? So there's a tremendous amount of opposition, and I think Gary and Nina articulated, I think, the origins of that, and I couldn't add to anything they said. I think there are a lot of myths that come in this realm when you start having science take on a religious fervor. And I'm a very religious individual, and so I appreciate religion, but I also appreciate my PhD mentor once said, scientists are seekers of truth, and there must come a hearty dose of humility in that realm, because you have to be prepared at any moment to discard your ideas if the evidence suggests that your notions are incorrect. We are dealing with a lot of incorrect notions. The fact that the developing fetus uses more ketones than any other part of that woman's body should be considered very relevant. The fact that a newborn gets into a deeper state of ketosis in just 2 hours of fasting than an adult would in 2 days of fasting, and yet you have ideas that abound where a dietitian will say that ketones are going to burn your brain, when ironically they're probably the most perfect fuel for the brain. So we have to deal with a lot of ideas to overcome, and I think, as Sally noted in the earlier panel, I do think there's reasons to be optimistic, although not naively. Not that we can sit back and rest on our accomplishments. There is work, but I'd like to think that the skids are getting greased with a healthy dose of saturated fat.
Well, this is kind of reminiscent of what we experienced in 2020, right? The COVID stuff. You know, I mean, it's everywhere in science that.
Yeah. When you say believe the science, right, you're not a scientist anymore.
Right.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. Like back in the early 1900s and even in the 1920s, the observation that the introduction of sugar into cultures was associated with the development of diabetes and obesity led many, many scientists to suggest that sugar was the driving cause of diabetes. Even Banting, who got the Nobel Prize, thought it was refined sugar and refined flours that was driving diabetes. But then Elliot Jocelyn in the 1920s came up with the idea that the reason we're getting obese is we're eating too much and we're exercising too little. And it sort of made sense. I mean, it was very logical, right? And in fact, you can show that many people are eating too much and exercising too little, but just, trying to reduce calories and exercise more doesn't really work. And what I believe we've learned is that carbs drive the desire to eat more and exercise less. So the story's still true to some extent. It's just that it's not being driven by choice. It's being driven by biology. And, Gary has the belief that the fat actually drives the process. So there's different ideas about what drives it, but the idea that it's just calories is really, not the standard belief. And yet many, remained the standard belief, sorry. And so this is what we're fighting against. And so, still many senior leaders think that it's calories, and yet we have all this evidence that that calories are important, but it's not the calories that drive obesity. It's the carbs.
Maybe coming back to your question about the politics of it, paradigm change is hard to do. I guess like that song, Breaking Up. Some of us have been hitting our heads against the wall most of our careers. But I think it's also important to avoid the tendency of demonizing our opponents or considering that the resistance is somehow improperly motivated. Nina mentioned Eisenhower's heart attack just 70 years ago this year. At that time, heart disease had the death rate from heart disease was almost double what it is today. And that reduction, although part of it has been decreased smoking, a lot of that has been pharma. The pharmaceutical industry has produced some very wonderful drugs to control blood pressure. I think the statins actually do reduce risk substantially on a standard American diet, and other drugs. They're doing what they were asked to do. And in a capitalist society, they're making profits. That's not their fault. It's up to the government to regulate it. But it's the same with the food industry. Earl Butz in the 70s was worried about the lack of enough food to feed the public and the world, and the food industry responded to incentives they were given. I don't blame the food industry for making these foods, many of which were called upon by our profession when we asked them to reduce fat and replace it with carbohydrates. I think what we need is to confront the realities that exist today scientifically, but also generate a political consensus so that the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry can make money in alignment with basic science and public health, not divorced from it. And that is the political challenge. And hopefully, we will rise to that occasion.
Keep that mic hot, because I want to ask you specifically, you have criticized the, I believe it's the NOVA definition of ultra-processed foods, and I think
I'm really going to get into trouble today.
Yeah, that's what I do best, is get people in trouble. So this is kind of top of mind for a lot of people as the new potential dietary guidelines come out. How are they even going to be structured? Is it going to be from a macronutrient level, or is it going to be broader and just saying, hey, ultra-processed food's bad? How do we define ultra-processed foods? There's a lot of discussion about that, and I believe you've commented on that in particular.
Yeah, I have a new paper out that's raising concern with others that the rush to adopt the notion of ultra-processed foods in this NOVA classification system into national nutrition policy could cause more harm than good. Now, who could be against ultra-processed foods? I mean, that is such a compelling term, and we all have a view of it. The bacon double cheeseburger, presumably with the bun and the fries and the Coke, and the whole range of industrial food products that we know inherently isn't doing us any favors. But the problem is that these compelling terms can confuse clear thinking about the precise mechanisms and therefore what to do about them. In public health, if we don't have a clear understanding of what the drivers are, then the arrows that we shoot at the problem could miss the mark. And so that's at least a waste of effort, and sometimes it can cause actual damage. In my view, and I think I'll have probably agreement from this panel, the problem is the processed carbohydrates. When you process a whole kernel, like oat groats, or when you process fruit into sugar, or whole grain into flour, it digests very quickly. There's no sort of rate-limiting step after eating sugar or flour into turning it into glucose, raising blood sugar and insulin. That happens in minutes. But the processing of fats or proteins doesn't really matter. I mean, olive oil is considered one of the healthiest foods you can eat. A steak might be 3 times as expensive as hamburger, but metabolically they're very similar. So by conflating all of these foods under the term ultra-processed, I think we waste a lot of effort and we take our eyes off of the big problem. When it comes to processing, it's, I guess, as James Carville, the guy who consulted for Clinton, said, it's the economy, stupid. Mm-hmm. Well, the same could be said about carbs.
So would you have no problem with processed meats in school lunches, like bologna and ham and turkey and all those kinds of things? That's not a problem?
Okay, so I think presumably we can all agree that the processing of fats, the mechanical processing, I'm not talking about hydrogenation or oxidation, that's chemical processes.
Okay.
But mechanical processing, turning peanuts into peanut butter. Does anybody have a problem with that? Is peanut butter inherently less healthful than peanuts? No. I mean, the same could be said, again, olives to olive oil, dark chocolate from cocoa nibs. I mean, very few people are going to eat cocoa nibs. Dark chocolate's a health food.
Made me very happy. Thank you.
As long as you don't add it too much sugar. the problem is processed meats is a wastebasket term. Are we talking about like a burger, which is just mechanically processed meat, or are we talking about a chicken nugget, which is more carbohydrate than protein? So certainly processed meats look bad in epidemiological studies. They're really consistent, and I think that's the case. But we don't know what that term processed meats involves. And I think if we just keep thinking about the basic nutrients, the processing of proteins is not a problem. The processing of fats is not a problem. The processing of carbohydrates is a huge problem. And we only have a few public health arrows to shoot. Let's aim them at the bullseye.
Are any of you concerned about how alterations in the food guidelines, it was kind of raised in the Q&A on the last panel, but how these alterations might affect other concerns, accessibility, the rise in meat processing and kind of big ag and the, what do we call it, industrial agriculture, where CAFOs, where all the, the quality of the food being produced, the cost, and then even cultural food traditions. As a Greek person, we have a lot of these, some carbohydrates, and they're kind of part of how I grew up. So any of those concerns? I know you guys are the scientists. So you're like, I just want to look at the...
I'll tell you what my concern is that we can create guidelines. We can say, okay, men should only eat 9 teaspoons of sugar a day. Women should only eat 6 teaspoons of sugar a day in general. And yet, we're not stopping people from buying a 20-ounce soda with 16 teaspoons of sugar. So the problem is we can create guidelines, but people are going to do what they want to do. And so the question is how, it's one thing to create wonderful guidelines, but how can we persuade people to follow the guidelines? And we can't do that if we're allowing soft drinks to have 16, 20 teaspoons of sugar. We could say to the to the soda industry, we could say, look, do it with 9 teaspoons of sugar, and if you have to add artificial sugars to make it the sweetness you want, do that. But don't go over the guideline limit. That's what I would like. I mean, forgive me, I'm not a politician. I don't, there's a lot of issues here. There's rights and all these things, but
there's pesky things.
Yeah, there are many things. But if you're a nutritionist and you're studying science and you go, hey, this stuff kills people when they eat this much, it's going to cause obesity, diabetes, hypertension, Alzheimer's, on all these diseases, and then we put out the guidelines and no one follows it. We've got to do something. I don't know what it is, if it's taxes or this or that.
Or removing subsidies.
Yeah, removing subsidies.
But I think also your comments about your Greek ancestry and traditional patterns, there is a lot of wisdom there, and that's sort of what the NOVA ultra-processed food system tries to capture. Why would traditional patterns evolve over hundreds of years? Well, they've evolved not to make us fat, actually to make us fit and able to feel good, to be healthy, reproduce, work in the fields. So traditional dietary patterns that didn't support health, would die out. Your neighboring community that is eating healthier and is stronger and fitter and better able to reproduce would outcompete you. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in these traditions, and we can learn from that, but let's also marry it to modern understanding of science, because we're never going to get away from guidelines. We're going to need them in some fashion. Let's make sure that they, take the wisdom of the ages, but also in light of modern mechanisms.
And people should eat more Greek food. It's pretty healthy.
I agree. Last question, and we kind of addressed your policy concerns, so I'm just going to skip to this one because I think this is a little bit of a controversial one too. Again, that's what I do. Do you have any concerns about the GLP-1 popular weight loss drugs? And okay, got a swift reaction from Dr. Bickman here, so go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have any hair to hide my reaction, so everything's so animated. Yeah, I do. That's not to say I am universally against them. I will try to be brief because I have so much respect for Rick and David. My view on GLP-1 is very heavily influenced by a paper published out of Scandinavia in 1996, where they documented the degree to which two distinct populations had a GLP-1 response to fat and to carbohydrate. And these two populations were lean and obese. And when they gave both groups a very high-fat meal, there was an equal GLP-1 response. Now, GLP-1 is a hormone that the gut makes. We all make it. One of its effects of many is to signal satiety, telling the brain, you're full, you don't need to eat. So back to the study, to both groups, obese or lean, they had a generally equal response with regards to GLP-1 in response to dietary fat. However, when they gave these two populations a high carbohydrate meal, whereas the lean group had an enormous GLP-1 response, the obese group did not have a statistically significant response at all. In other words, that little line that was squiggling around over that 3-hour time period did not reach a point of significantly higher. In fact, if anything, at the 3-hour mark, it went significantly down. Now imagine the relevance of this, where these two friends are going out to eat they're going to eat an Italian meal, if not a Greek meal, and it's a bunch of pasta, let's say. Am I stereotyping? I don't mean to.
Okay, I'm Italian too.
Okay,
I don't take offense.
Thank you. So then imagine these two individuals. The lean individual eats this high carbohydrate meal, enjoys their robust GLP-1 response and all of the satiety that comes with it, and pushes the plate away and pats their stomach contentedly. Whereas the obese colleague eats that same amount and, in the absence of any GLP-1 response, is left wondering when the next course is coming. And so to me, the value of GLP-1 drugs is real, but I think it should be coupled with information and education that helps a person understand you're struggling with your weight, not necessarily because you're eating too much, but you're eating the wrong stuff. And you're eating too much carbohydrate. And the combination of all of those calories, and it pains me to invoke the calorie, but nevertheless, all those carbons that we call calories, combined with an insulin spike, is making you store a lot of that as fat. And you have a hard time controlling your consumption because in all the neurobiology of addiction in humans, there's no evidence of addiction. No one's craving bacon and eggs on a Saturday night, right? It's something that's carby, it's starchy, it's sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy. So we tell the person, you're eating too much carbohydrate. You need to restrict your amount of carbohydrates. In some people, with that proper information, they can make the change. They know what to do to make a change. Most people are still trying to starve themselves to weight loss. Some people will be given that information, control your carbs, and they can't do it. Like a meth addict, they keep coming back to it every night or every 2 days. That's where I think the intervention has the most value, which is to say, this isn't a weight loss drug. It's a drug that's going to help you hone your ability to resist the clarion call of carbohydrates, resist this temptation, and thereby start to change your eating habits. So my view is they should be used at a lower dose, with the explicit advice to use this to control your addiction to carbohydrates, and then give them an opportunity with proper education to cycle off the drug at maybe, say, 90 days or so to see whether some of these habits have stuck. Now, I understand that's probably a very naive and rosy view, but to sum it all up again, lower doses and then cycled off, all with the foundation of education to help them learn to control their consumption of carbs.
But I think this is how we should approach all pharmaceuticals, that they're not the permanent answer. They are the pathway to really restore natural, healthy functions to the body.
Yeah, I want to echo what Ben is saying is that we should try diet, nutrition first before we go to a GLP-1. But the three things, GLP-1s are wonder drugs, but they're expensive, they have side effects, and there's a high relapse rate. But if you follow Ben's recommendation to reduce your carbs, there's data showing that if you go on a keto or a very low carb diet, when you stop the GLP-1, you won't regain the weight. So there really is this carb story behind the GLP-1s.
So it's a helper to make the changes so that when you go off it, you're still okay Any last thoughts?
I agree. I wrote a paper with the guy who might get the Nobel Prize for GLP-1, Jens Holst. He's a Danish guy, and he's a drug man, and I'm a diet man. We met in the middle. Yeah, Jens Holst. That's his career. But we met in the middle by, acknowledging that there certainly is a role for these new drugs. They're remarkable and unlike anything we've had in the past. He acknowledged we can't put everybody on these drugs and we need diet. And then we explored together why a low-carb diet and these drugs actually shared the same mechanisms. These drugs look like a low-carb diet. They slow down gastric emptying, which is what a low-carb diet. They lower blood sugar, they lower insulin immediately. They improve leptin sensitivity, they tend to increase metabolic rate. And so by putting them together, you get synergy. You can use less drug, avoid some of the side effects, and then have something to transition to when you don't want to stay on the drug for the rest of your life. So that's a study that we need to get funded one way or another.
In fact, it'll be funny, David, for me to invoke an NIH scientist, actually whom I will not name, an individual who attempts to bury any positive evidence on low-carb diets, found that I think fasted GLP-1 levels on a low-carbohydrate diet, isocaloric, were about 3 times higher on a low-carb diet than on the high-carb isocaloric version. So even if GLP-1 is a good thing, all the more reason to at least couple it, if not, well, certainly start with control carbs, and then use that as a complement during the entire course, and then certainly after.
Well, on that happy come together note, so no extremes, we find a middle path. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking our experts. And we actually don't have time. We don't have time for Q&A. The good thing is we do have lunch for you all, of course, speaking of food. And our guest experts will be hopefully around. So if you do want to ask them any questions, respectfully, keeping in mind they have time and probably a lot of people want to ask them questions, you feel free to do so. But other than that, thank you so much for coming, everyone. I hope it was insightful, educational, and there is food appropriately partitioned out for this topic in the back.